Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of royal tradition meet modern media scrutiny, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. What started as whispered conversations in marble corridors would soon explode into headlines across the globe, forcing a future king to break his silence and a reigning monarch to make decisions that could alter the course of royal history forever. The world thought they knew the royal family through carefully orchestrated public appearances and official statements. But beneath the polished surface of state dinners and charity galas, tensions had been simmering for years. Old wounds, family disagreements, and competing visions for the monarchy's future were about to collide in ways no one could have predicted. When Prince William finally decided to speak out, his words would send shockwaves through the establishment and force his father, King Charles, to confront the most challenging crisis of his reign. The palace walls that had protected royal secrets for generations were about to crumble, revealing truths that would change public perception of the monarchy forever. This is the story of how family loyalty, institutional pressure, and personal conviction came together in a perfect storm that no amount of royal protocol could contain. It's a tale of courage, consequences, and the price of speaking truth to power when that power wears a crown. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Prince William made his way through the ancient corridors he had known since childhood. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on his shoulders, each step echoing with the gravity of the decision that lay before him. For weeks, he had wrestled with information that could change everything about how the public viewed the royal family. And today, he could no longer remain silent. The crisis had begun 3 months earlier during what should have been a routine family gathering at Balmoral Castle. King Charles had called together his closest advisors and immediate family members for what he described as a strategic planning session for the monarchy's future. The meeting was meant to address ongoing public relations challenges and establish a unified approach to modernizing the institution while maintaining its traditions. William had arrived at the Scottish estate expecting discussions about charity patronages and public engagement strategies. Instead, he found himself in the middle of revelations that would fundamentally challenge his understanding of his family's recent decisions and their impact on both the monarchy and the people it served. The first shock came when his father's private secretary presented a comprehensive report on media management strategies that had been implemented over the past 2 years. The document detailed how certain stories had been carefully planted in friendly publications while others had been aggressively suppressed through legal threats and backroom negotiations with editors. William learned that several positive stories about his own charitable work had been strategically released to overshadow negative coverage of other family members, without his knowledge or consent. But it was the second revelation that truly stunned him. Hidden within the financial reports was evidence of significant expenditures on what was euphemistically called reputation management. Substantial sums had been paid to private investigators to gather information on journalists, photographers, and even members of the public who had been critical of the royal family on social media. The scope of surveillance was far broader than William had ever imagined, extending to monitoring the private communications of staff members and tracking the movements of former employees who might pose a threat to royal privacy. As William absorbed this information, he began to understand the true extent of the palace's efforts to control public perception. Phone calls were made to pressure news organizations to kill stories. Social media accounts were monitored and analyzed for potential threats to the royal reputation. Even charitable organizations that had received royal patronage found themselves subject to subtle pressure to present only positive narratives about their royal connections. The meeting continued with discussions of more aggressive strategies for the future. Charles spoke passionately about the need to protect the monarchy from what he saw as unfair attacks from both traditional media and social platforms. He outlined plans for expanded legal action against publications that crossed certain lines and proposed new restrictions on staff members' ability to communicate with outsiders, even after leaving royal employment. William found himself increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation progressed. While he understood the challenges his family faced in maintaining their privacy and dignity in an age of instant communication and relentless media attention, the methods being discussed seemed to go far beyond reasonable protection into territory that troubled his conscience. The breaking point came when Charles revealed his intentions regarding several ongoing legal disputes. The king had authorized substantial legal expenditures to pursue cases against individuals who had shared information about royal activities, even when that information was largely factual. The goal, as Charles explained it, was not necessarily to win these cases, but to send a clear message that challenging the royal family would come with serious financial and legal consequences. Among the targets of these legal actions were former staff members who had spoken to journalists about working conditions within the royal households, photographers who had captured images the palace deemed inappropriate, and even a small charity that had criticized the environmental impact of certain royal travel decisions. William realized that the legal pressure being applied was designed to silence legitimate criticism and accountability, not just to protect genuine privacy concerns. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the castle's grand dining room, William struggled to maintain normal conversation while his mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. He watched his father hold court at the head of the table, discussing plans for upcoming engagements and speaking enthusiastically about new initiatives, seemingly untroubled by the morning's revelations. The contrast between the public image of the caring, environmentally conscious King Charles and the private reality of an institution willing to use surveillance and legal intimidation to protect itself was stark. William began to question how many other aspects of royal life operated according to principles that would shock the public if they became known. Over the following days at Balmoral, William made a conscious effort to pay closer attention to conversations and decisions that he might have previously accepted without question. He noticed how staff members seemed nervous around certain topics, how communications were carefully monitored, and how even family discussions were influenced by considerations of potential public relations impact. The final straw came during a private conversation between William and his father on the last day of the gathering. Charles, perhaps sensing his son's discomfort, attempted to explain his philosophy about protecting the monarchy. He spoke about the heavy burden of responsibility he felt to preserve the institution for future generations, and his belief that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. Charles revealed that he had been advised by security experts that threats to the royal family were evolving and becoming more sophisticated. Social media had created new vulnerabilities, and traditional approaches to managing public perception were no longer sufficient. He argued that the measures being taken were defensive actions necessary to protect not just individual family members, but the stability of the constitutional monarchy itself. William listened carefully to his father's reasoning, understanding the genuine pressures and concerns that motivated these decisions. But he could not shake the feeling that the line between legitimate protection and inappropriate control had been crossed. The revelation that private investigators had been used to monitor critics seemed particularly troubling, as it suggested a level of paranoia and overreach that could undermine public trust if it became known. As he prepared to leave Balmoral, William realized that he faced an impossible choice. Remaining silent about what he had learned would make him complicit in activities that violated his personal principles and potentially betrayed the public trust that was essential to the monarchy's legitimacy. But speaking out would create a crisis within his family and could damage the institution he was destined to lead. The drive back to London gave William time to reflect on the full scope of what he had discovered. The surveillance operations, the legal intimidation campaigns, and the manipulation of media coverage all pointed to a systematic effort to insulate the royal family from accountability and criticism. While he could understand the desire to protect privacy and maintain dignity, the methods being employed seemed to cross ethical boundaries that he could not accept. Most troubling was the realization that these activities were being conducted in his name as well as his father's. Positive stories about his charitable work had been strategically planted without his knowledge, potentially undermining the authentic impact of causes he genuinely cared about. His reputation was being managed as a corporate asset rather than as the natural result of his actions and character. Upon returning to Kensington Palace, William began his own careful investigation into the extent of the activities he had learned about. He reached out to trusted staff members and longtime palace employees, asking careful questions about procedures and protocols that he had never previously scrutinized. What he discovered only deepened his concerns about how far the palace had strayed from principles of transparency and ethical behavior. The surveillance program was more extensive than even the Balmoral briefing had indicated. Private communication channels existed for monitoring not just external threats, but internal staff discussions and family member activities. Legal teams were maintained on retainers specifically for intimidating potential critics through strategic litigation. Media manipulation had become so sophisticated that positive and negative coverage could be orchestrated with remarkable precision across multiple platforms and publications. William also learned about financial arrangements that troubled him deeply. Substantial sums were being paid to secure favorable coverage and suppress negative stories, creating a system where journalistic independence was systematically undermined. Some publications had developed financial dependencies on royal advertising and exclusive access that compromised their ability to provide objective coverage of royal activities. The more William investigated, the more he understood that the problem was not just about specific surveillance operations or legal tactics. The entire relationship between the monarchy and the public had been corrupted by a system that prioritized image management over authentic accountability. The trust that should exist between the royal family and the people they served was being maintained through manipulation rather than genuine transparency and ethical behavior. As autumn progressed, and the revelations continued to weigh on his conscience, William began to recognize that he could not continue to participate in this system without taking action. The question was not whether he should speak out, but how he could do so in a way that would address the problems without causing unnecessary damage to the institution of monarchy itself. The decision that would change everything was beginning to form in his mind, but William knew that once he crossed this line, there would be no going back. The palace secrets that had been carefully guarded for so long were about to face their greatest threat from within, and the consequences would reshape the royal family forever. The decision to act came to Prince William during a particularly difficult week in November, when he witnessed firsthand how the palace's secret operations affected real people's lives. A young journalist named Sarah Mitchell had been pursuing a story about environmental concerns related to a royal estate's land management practices. Her investigation was thorough, fair, and focused on legitimate public interest issues rather than personal attacks or sensationalism. William learned about Sarah's situation through a casual conversation with an environmental activist he had worked with on conservation projects. The activist mentioned that a promising young journalist had suddenly abandoned an important environmental story after facing what seemed like coordinated pressure from multiple directions. Intrigued and concerned, William quietly investigated further and discovered that Sarah had indeed been targeted by the palace's reputation management system. The campaign against Sarah had been sophisticated and ruthless. Private investigators had been hired to examine her personal life, looking for any information that could be used to discredit her professionally or personally. Her editors had received phone calls from palace lawyers questioning the accuracy of her reporting and threatening legal action if the story was published. Even more troubling, her landlord had been contacted by individuals claiming to be conducting routine background checks, creating pressure in her personal life that seemed designed to distract her from her professional work. When William discreetly reached out to Sarah through intermediaries, he learned that the stress of these tactics had taken a serious toll on her mental health and career prospects. She had been forced to abandon not just the royal story, but several other environmental investigations because editors were now reluctant to assign her to stories that might attract similar pressure. A talented journalist who should have been advancing in her career was instead struggling to find work because she had dared to ask legitimate questions about royal land management practices. This personal example of how the palace's tactics affected innocent individuals crystallized William's resolve to take action. He realized that the system his father had created was not just ethically questionable in abstract terms, but was actively harming people who were simply trying to do their jobs and serve the public interest. The environmental story that Sarah had been investigating was exactly the kind of accountability journalism that a constitutional monarchy should welcome, not suppress. William began developing a plan to address the situation, knowing that he would need to be strategic in his approach. Simply confronting his father directly would likely result in the continuation of these practices under greater secrecy. Instead, he needed to find a way to expose the problems while maintaining his ability to influence positive change from within the royal system. His first step was to document everything he could about the surveillance and intimidation operations. Working carefully and discreetly, he gathered evidence of the private investigation contracts, legal intimidation campaigns, and media manipulation strategies. He photographed relevant documents during family meetings and recorded conversations when he could do so without detection. Building this evidence file was risky, but William knew that any accusations he eventually made would need to be backed by concrete proof. The documentation process revealed even more troubling details about the scope of the palace's activities. William discovered that the surveillance operations extended beyond monitoring critics and journalists to include tracking the activities of family members themselves. His own communications were being monitored, ostensibly for security purposes, but with a level of detail that suggested the information was being used for strategic planning rather than genuine protection. He also learned that the palace had developed detailed profiles of potential future threats, including young activists, environmental campaigners, and even university students who had organized protests related to royal activities. These profiles included personal information about family backgrounds, financial situations, and relationship histories that could potentially be used for intimidation or discrediting purposes. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that the palace maintained a network of contacts within various institutions who provided information about individuals who might pose reputational threats. This network included sources within news organizations, government agencies, and even charitable organizations that had received royal patronage. The level of infiltration and information gathering suggested a paranoid mindset that viewed virtually any criticism or accountability effort as a potential threat to be neutralized. As William compiled this evidence, he also began reaching out to individuals who had been affected by palace intimidation tactics. Through careful intermediary contacts, he learned about dozens of cases where legitimate criticism or investigation had been met with disproportionate legal and financial pressure. The pattern was clear. The palace was using its resources and connections to silence anyone who might damage the royal reputation, regardless of whether their concerns were valid or their methods were ethical. One particularly troubling case involved a former palace employee who had attempted to raise concerns about financial irregularities in charitable fund management. Rather than investigating these concerns through proper channels, the palace had launched a comprehensive campaign to discredit the whistleblower, including hiring private investigators to dig into their personal life and threatening legal action for violating confidentiality agreements. The employee had eventually been forced to sign additional non-disclosure agreements and accept a financial settlement in exchange for remaining silent about both the original concerns and the intimidation campaign itself. Another case involved a small environmental organization that had questioned the carbon footprint of certain royal travel arrangements. The organization's funding had been threatened through pressure on their major donors, several of whom had business relationships that made them vulnerable to royal influence. The organization had been forced to retract their criticisms and issue a public apology, despite the fact that their calculations had been accurate and their concerns legitimate. These examples helped William understand that the palace's activities were not just about protecting privacy or preventing false information from being published. Instead, they represented a systematic effort to avoid accountability and suppress legitimate criticism, even when that criticism could lead to positive improvements in royal operations and environmental impact. William also discovered that the intimidation tactics were having a chilling effect that extended far beyond the specific individuals and organizations that were directly targeted. Journalists were self-censoring their coverage of royal activities, knowing that asking difficult questions could result in career-damaging pressure campaigns. Environmental and social justice organizations were avoiding criticism of royal activities even when such criticism was warranted. Academic researchers were steering clear of topics related to the monarchy's environmental impact or financial transparency. This broader chilling effect meant that the palace's reputation management strategy was successful in the short term, as critical coverage and accountability pressure decreased significantly. However, William recognized that this success came at the cost of the authentic dialogue and transparency that were essential for maintaining public trust in the long term. By silencing critics rather than addressing their concerns, the royal family was creating the conditions for a much more serious crisis when the truth eventually emerged. The international implications of these activities also troubled William deeply. The British royal family's reputation for dignity and ethical behavior was an important component of the United Kingdom's soft power and international influence. If news of surveillance and intimidation campaigns became public, it could damage not just the monarchy's reputation, but Britain's standing as a champion of democratic values and press freedom. William began to understand that his father's well-intentioned efforts to protect the monarchy were actually endangering its long-term survival. The tactics being employed were fundamentally incompatible with the values of transparency and accountability that modern democratic societies expected from their institutions. By trying to control criticism rather than addressing its underlying causes, the palace was creating a powder keg that could explode at any moment. The psychological toll of carrying this knowledge began to affect William's daily life and public duties. During official engagements, He found himself wondering which aspects of the positive coverage he received were authentic and which were the result of strategic media manipulation. When he met with environmental groups or charitable organizations, he questioned whether their enthusiastic reception was genuine or influenced by fear of palace retaliation if they expressed any criticism. Most painfully, William's relationship with his father became increasingly strained as he struggled to maintain normal family interactions while harboring such serious concerns about Charles's decisions. Family dinners and private conversations became exercises in careful diplomacy, as William tried to avoid topics that might reveal his growing opposition to the palace's tactics, while still attempting to understand his father's perspective and motivations. The breaking point came in early December, when William learned that the palace was planning to escalate its tactics in response to what Charles perceived as increasing media hostility. New surveillance technologies were being considered that would allow for more comprehensive monitoring of potential threats. Legal teams were being expanded to pursue more aggressive litigation strategies. Most troubling, there were discussions about using the palace's political connections to pressure government regulators to take action against news organizations that published critical coverage. William realized that remaining silent any longer would make him complicit in activities that could fundamentally undermine British democracy and press freedom. The surveillance state that his father was creating in the name of protecting the monarchy was becoming a threat to the very democratic institutions that gave the monarchy its legitimacy and public support. The decision to speak out was not just about exposing wrongdoing, but about preventing a much larger crisis that could destroy the constitutional monarchy entirely. William understood that short-term damage to the royal family's reputation was preferable to the long-term consequences of allowing these activities to continue and potentially expand. The secrets that were being protected were becoming more dangerous than the truth they were meant to conceal. As December progressed, William began preparing for the most difficult decision of his life. He would need to find a way to expose the palace's activities while minimizing damage to the institution he was destined to lead. The plan he was developing would require careful timing, strategic allies, and the courage to confront his father directly about activities that threatened everything the monarchy claimed to represent. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of royal family loyalty and force King Charles to make choices that would define his reign and the future of the British monarchy. William's decision to speak out would soon trigger a series of events that no amount of reputation management could control or contain. The confrontation that would change the course of royal history began on a cold December morning in King Charles's private study at Buckingham Palace. William had requested an urgent private meeting with his father, using the pretext of discussing upcoming Christmas arrangements and charitable initiatives for the new year. As he walked through the familiar corridors toward the study, William carried with him a carefully prepared file containing documentation of the palace's surveillance and intimidation activities. Charles was reviewing correspondence when William entered, the morning light streaming through the tall windows casting shadows across the antique desk that had served previous monarchs for generations. The king looked up with a warm smile, genuinely pleased to spend time with his eldest son and heir. The irony was not lost on William that he was about to shatter this peaceful family moment with revelations that would fundamentally alter their relationship forever. The conversation began normally enough, with Charles sharing his thoughts about upcoming state visits and expressing enthusiasm for environmental initiatives that he and William had been developing together. For a moment, William questioned whether he was making the right decision in confronting his father directly. The man across from him was clearly dedicated to his role and genuinely believed he was serving the best interests of the monarchy and the British people. But as Charles began discussing his satisfaction with recent improvements in media coverage and public perception of the royal family, William realized that his father was completely disconnected from the ethical implications of the methods being used to achieve these improvements. The surveillance operations, legal intimidation campaigns, and media manipulation had become so normalized within the palace system that Charles spoke about them as routine administrative matters rather than as serious ethical concerns. William took a deep breath and began his carefully planned approach. He started by expressing his concern about reports he had heard regarding pressure being applied to journalists and environmental organizations. Rather than immediately revealing the extent of his knowledge, he wanted to give his father an opportunity to explain or defend the activities in question. Charles's initial response was dismissive, suggesting that William was being overly sensitive to criticism from individuals who did not understand the complexities of modern royal duties. He explained that some defensive measures were necessary to protect the family's privacy and prevent the spread of misinformation that could damage the monarchy's reputation and effectiveness. As the conversation continued, William gradually revealed more of what he had learned, watching his father's demeanor shift from casual dismissal to defensive justification to growing concern about the source of his son's information. Charles began asking pointed questions about how William had acquired such detailed knowledge of internal security and public relations operations. The turning point came when William placed the documentation file on the desk between them and began outlining specific examples of how palace tactics had affected real people's lives. He spoke about Sarah Mitchell, the environmental journalist who had been driven from her career for asking legitimate questions. He described the former palace employee who had been intimidated into silence about financial irregularities. He detailed the systematic campaign to silence environmental organizations and academic researchers. Charles's face grew increasingly pale as he realized the extent of William's knowledge and the implications of his son's obvious opposition to these activities. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the tactics he had authorized were being viewed not as necessary protective measures, but as unethical abuses of power that violated fundamental principles of democratic accountability and press freedom. The discussion that followed was intense and emotional, with both men struggling to understand how their perspectives on protecting the monarchy had diverged so dramatically. Charles spoke passionately about the pressures he faced as king and his responsibility to preserve the institution for future generations. He described the constant threats from hostile media coverage, social media attacks, and political criticism that made defensive measures seem necessary for survival. William listened carefully to his father's concerns while maintaining his position that the methods being employed were fundamentally wrong and ultimately counterproductive. He argued that by silencing critics rather than addressing their legitimate concerns, the palace was creating exactly the kind of crisis that it claimed to be preventing. Trust and credibility could not be maintained through intimidation and manipulation, but only through genuine transparency and ethical behavior. The conversation revealed deep philosophical differences between father and son about the nature of modern monarchy and its relationship with democratic society. Charles's generation had grown up understanding the royal family as an institution that required protection from public scrutiny in order to maintain its mystique and effectiveness. William's generation saw transparency and accountability as essential components of legitimacy in contemporary democratic systems. As the meeting progressed, Charles began to understand that his son was not simply raising concerns that could be addressed through minor policy adjustments. William was challenging the fundamental approach that the palace had taken toward managing its relationship with the public and the media. The surveillance operations, legal intimidation tactics, and media manipulation strategies were not isolated problems, but symptoms of a broader systemic approach that William believed was incompatible with democratic values. The most difficult moment came when William made clear that he could not continue to participate in royal duties while these activities continued under his name and with his implicit endorsement. He explained that every positive story written about his charitable work was now tainted by the knowledge that it might have been strategically planted or that the journalist writing it might have been influenced by fear of palace retaliation for critical coverage. Charles was shocked by the depth of his son's opposition and the ultimatum that was implicit in his position. The heir to the throne was essentially demanding that the king dismantle security and public relations operations that had been developed over years and had been effective in reducing negative coverage and preventing embarrassing revelations. The king's initial response was to argue that William was naive about the realities of modern royal life and the sophisticated threats that the monarchy faced in the digital age. He pointed out that traditional approaches to managing royal reputation were no longer sufficient when social media could spread false information instantly, and when investigative journalists had access to communication technologies that made privacy almost impossible to maintain. William acknowledged these challenges while maintaining that the palace's response had been disproportionate and ultimately self-defeating. He argued that the monarchy's strength had always come from its moral authority and its ability to represent the best values of British society. By engaging in surveillance and intimidation tactics, the royal family was undermining the very foundation of its public support and constitutional legitimacy. The confrontation reached its climax when William presented his father with a stark choice. Either the surveillance operations would be terminated, the intimidation campaigns would end, and the palace would commit to genuine transparency and ethical behavior, or William would be forced to publicly distance himself from these activities in ways that would inevitably expose them to public scrutiny. Charles was stunned by what amounted to a threat from his own son and heir. The idea that William would consider publicly opposing palace policies was almost unthinkable within the context of royal family loyalty and institutional solidarity. Yet the determination in William's voice and the thoroughness of his documentation made clear that this was not a bluff or an emotional outburst, but a carefully considered position based on deep moral conviction. The immediate aftermath of this confrontation was a period of tense silence, as both men contemplated the implications of what had been said. Charles realized that he was facing the most serious crisis of his reign, not from external critics, but from within his own family. The heir to the throne was threatening to expose activities that could destroy public confidence in the monarchy if they became widely known. William, meanwhile, was grappling with the recognition that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. By directly confronting his father and threatening public exposure, he had fundamentally altered their relationship and potentially set in motion a chain of events that could lead to constitutional crisis. In the days following this confrontation, both Charles and William retreated to consider their options and consult with trusted advisors. The king found himself in the impossible position of choosing between maintaining security operations that he believed were necessary for protecting the monarchy and risking a public break with his son that could be even more damaging than the revelations he was trying to prevent. Charles began consulting with his closest advisors about possible responses to William's ultimatum. Some argued for standing firm and attempting to convince William that his position was unrealistic and dangerous. Others suggested that compromise might be possible through scaling back some of the more aggressive tactics while maintaining essential security measures. A few advisors began to worry that the surveillance operations had indeed gone too far and that William's concerns were justified. The palace staff members who were aware of the confrontation found themselves in an extremely difficult position. Long-term employees who had implemented the surveillance and intimidation operations under direct orders from the king now faced the possibility that these same activities would be exposed and condemned by the heir to the throne. The potential for career damage and legal liability began to create additional pressure within the royal household. Meanwhile, William spent the days after the confrontation carefully considering his next steps. He had given his father an ultimatum, but he had not specified a timeline for compliance or detailed what his response would be if Charles refused to change course. The decision about whether and how to proceed with public disclosure would be the most consequential choice of his life. The stage was now set for King Charles to make the most difficult decision of his reign. He could attempt to preserve the surveillance and reputation management operations that he believed were essential for protecting the monarchy, risking a public break with his son and potential exposure of activities that could devastate royal credibility. Or he could dismantle these operations and return to a more traditional approach to royal public relations, potentially leaving the family vulnerable to the very threats he had been trying to neutralize. The next phase of this crisis would test not just the relationship between father and son, but the fundamental principles upon which the modern British monarchy was built. The decisions made in the coming days would determine whether the institution could adapt to democratic expectations of transparency and accountability, or whether it would continue down a path that William believed could ultimately lead to its destruction. King Charles spent 3 sleepless nights after his confrontation with William, pacing the private apartments of Buckingham Palace as he wrestled with the most difficult decision of his life. The ultimatum from his son had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the direction his reign had taken and the methods he had authorized to protect the monarchy. The documentation that William had presented was undeniable, and the moral arguments his son had made were beginning to resonate despite Charles's initial resistance. On the 4th morning, Charles summoned his most trusted advisor, Sir Malcolm Whitfield, who had served the royal family for over 2 decades and had been instrumental in developing many of the surveillance and reputation management strategies that were now under scrutiny. The meeting took place in the king's private study, the same room where the confrontation with William had occurred, and the weight of that conversation hung heavy in the air. Charles began by outlining William's concerns and demands, watching carefully as Sir Malcolm's expression shifted from surprise to concern to barely concealed alarm. The advisor had not realized that the heir to the throne had gained such detailed knowledge of internal operations, nor had he anticipated that these activities would be viewed so negatively by someone within the royal family itself. Sir Malcolm's initial response was to defend the programs he had helped create, arguing that they had been successful in reducing negative coverage and preventing potentially damaging revelations from becoming public. He presented statistics showing decreased criticism in major publications, fewer hostile investigative pieces, and improved public opinion polling numbers that he attributed directly to their reputation management efforts. However, as Charles pressed him to address the specific ethical concerns that William had raised, Sir Malcolm began to acknowledge that some operations may have extended beyond their original scope and intentions. The surveillance of critics had become more comprehensive than originally planned. The legal intimidation tactics had been applied to cases where the public interest in disclosure might have outweighed privacy concerns. The media manipulation strategies had created relationships with journalists that potentially compromised their independence. The conversation continued for hours as Charles and his advisor examined each component of the reputation management system that had been built during the early years of his reign. What had started as reasonable defensive measures to protect royal privacy had gradually evolved into an extensive network of surveillance, legal pressure, and media manipulation that bore little resemblance to the limited protective measures originally envisioned. Charles began to understand that the system had developed its own momentum, with staff members feeling pressure to demonstrate results and justify budgets by expanding operations and pursuing increasingly aggressive tactics. What should have been a carefully controlled defensive strategy had become a proactive campaign to eliminate any potential source of criticism or accountability, regardless of whether such criticism was fair or justified. The turning point in Charles's thinking came when Sir Malcolm reluctantly admitted that several recent operations had produced minimal benefits while creating significant risks of exposure and public backlash. The campaign against Sarah Mitchell, the environmental journalist, had been particularly problematic because her story about royal land management practices was fundamentally accurate and addressed legitimate public concerns about environmental stewardship. Sir Malcolm revealed that he had actually advised against pursuing the Mitchell case so aggressively, but had been overruled by other advisors who argued that allowing any critical environmental reporting to proceed would encourage similar investigations by other journalists. The decision to intimidate Mitchell had been driven more by the desire to send a warning message to other potential critics than by any genuine threat her specific story posed to royal interests. This revelation helped Charles understand that the reputation management system had become self-perpetuating, with each successful intimidation campaign creating pressure to pursue similar tactics against increasingly marginal threats. The staff responsible for these operations had developed a mindset where any criticism of royal activities was viewed as a threat to be neutralized rather than feedback to be considered and addressed. As the day progressed, Charles found himself reviewing files and reports that he had previously approved without fully understanding their implications. The private investigation reports on critics contained far more personal information than he had realized, including details about family relationships, financial difficulties, and personal struggles that had no relevance to the individual's criticism of royal activities, but could potentially be used for blackmail or intimidation. The legal intimidation campaigns had also expanded beyond what Charles had originally authorized. Initial plans to respond firmly to false or defamatory coverage had evolved into preemptive legal threats against journalists and organizations that were simply asking questions or raising concerns that might lead to critical coverage. The palace legal team had developed template letters and standard procedures for pressuring news organizations that treated any scrutiny as grounds for legal action. Perhaps most troubling was the revelation that the media manipulation strategies had created financial dependencies that compromised journalistic independence. Several publications had come to rely on royal advertising revenue and exclusive access arrangements that made them reluctant to publish critical coverage even when it was warranted. The palace had essentially purchased favorable coverage through economic pressure rather than earning it through transparent and ethical behavior. Charles also learned that the surveillance operations had expanded to include monitoring royal family members themselves, supposedly for security purposes, but with a level of detail that suggested the information was being used for strategic planning and control rather than genuine protection. William's communications had indeed been monitored, along with those of other family members, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and control within the royal household itself. That evening, Charles took an unprecedented step by requesting a private meeting with several individuals who had been targets of palace intimidation campaigns. Through carefully arranged intermediary contacts, he spoke with former staff members, journalists, and environmental activists who had experienced the impact of his authorization decisions firsthand. These conversations were deeply uncomfortable for Charles, as he was forced to confront the human cost of the policies he had approved. He heard about careers that had been damaged, mental health impacts from sustained pressure campaigns, and the broader chilling effect that palace tactics had created within the environmental and journalistic communities that should have been natural allies of a monarch committed to public service and environmental stewardship. One particularly powerful conversation was with a former palace employee who had attempted to raise concerns about financial irregularities in charitable fund management. The individual described the psychological trauma of being subjected to private investigation, legal threats, and professional blacklisting for trying to ensure that charitable donations were being used appropriately. The employee had ultimately been forced to sign restrictive non-disclosure agreements and accept a financial settlement to avoid complete career destruction. Another conversation was with an environmental researcher who had been investigating the carbon footprint of royal travel arrangements. The researcher explained how pressure on their institutional funding and threats of legal action had forced them to abandon not just the royal investigation but several other environmental projects. The intimidation campaign had effectively removed an important voice from environmental research and advocacy at a time when such work was desperately needed. These personal accounts helped Charles understand that the abstract policy decisions he had made in palace meetings had real-world consequences for individuals who were simply trying to do their jobs or serve the public interest. The reputation management system had not just protected royal privacy, but had actively harmed people whose only crime was asking legitimate questions or raising valid concerns about royal activities. By the end of the week, Charles had reached a painful but necessary conclusion. The surveillance and intimidation operations that had been created to protect the monarchy were actually threatening its long-term survival by undermining the trust and credibility that were essential to its constitutional role. William's ultimatum was not just a family crisis, but a warning about institutional dangers that required immediate action. The decision to dismantle the reputation management system would be costly and difficult. It would require admitting that serious mistakes had been made and that innocent people had been harmed by royal authorization. It would mean accepting increased vulnerability to criticism and negative coverage. It would also require rebuilding relationships with journalists, environmental groups, and other organizations that had been alienated by palace intimidation tactics. However, Charles recognized that the alternative was potentially catastrophic. If William proceeded with his threat to publicly expose these activities, the resulting scandal could destroy public confidence in the monarchy entirely. The surveillance and intimidation campaigns would be revealed as systematic abuses of power that violated fundamental democratic principles. The constitutional crisis that would result could lead to serious discussions about whether the monarchy had any place in modern British society. More importantly, Charles was beginning to understand that his son was right about the fundamental ethical issues at stake. The monarchy's legitimacy depended on its moral authority and its ability to represent the best values of British society. By engaging in surveillance and intimidation tactics, the royal family had forfeited the moral high ground that was essential to its constitutional role and public support. The king began preparing for one of the most difficult conversations of his reign. He would need to meet with William again to acknowledge the validity of his concerns and outline a plan for addressing the problems that had been identified. This would require not just policy changes, but a fundamental shift in the palace's approach to managing its relationship with the public and the media. Charles also began planning for the extensive reforms that would be necessary to restore public confidence and rebuild damaged relationships. The surveillance operations would need to be terminated, intimidation campaigns would need to be halted, and victims of palace pressure would need to receive appropriate acknowledgement and compensation. Most importantly, new procedures would need to be established to ensure that such abuses could never happen again. The stage was set for King Charles to make his move, not in the chess-like maneuvering of reputation management and political strategy, but in the much more difficult arena of moral leadership and institutional reform. The decisions he made in the coming days would determine whether the British monarchy could adapt to democratic expectations and regain the trust that had been damaged by years of surveillance and intimidation. The future of the institution would depend on his willingness to choose transparency over control, accountability over protection, and ethical behavior over short-term tactical advantage. The second meeting between King Charles and Prince William took place on a gray January morning, exactly 1 month after their initial confrontation. This time, the atmosphere in the king's study was markedly different. Charles had spent weeks investigating the concerns his son had raised, speaking with victims of palace intimidation campaigns, and consulting with constitutional experts about the implications of the surveillance operations. The weight of these discoveries had fundamentally changed his perspective on decisions he had previously defended. William entered the study with careful optimism, unsure whether his father had genuinely reconsidered his position or was simply preparing more sophisticated arguments to defend the status quo. The documentation file that had sparked their previous confrontation sat on Charles's desk, now accompanied by additional reports and legal opinions that the king had commissioned to understand the full scope of the problems that needed to be addressed. Charles began the conversation by acknowledging that William's concerns had been entirely justified and that the surveillance and intimidation operations had indeed violated fundamental principles of democratic accountability and ethical governance. This admission represented a profound shift from his defensive posture during their previous meeting and immediately changed the dynamic between father and son. The king outlined the investigation he had conducted over the past month, describing his conversations with individuals who had been targeted by palace pressure campaigns, and his growing understanding of how defensive measures had evolved into offensive operations that actively harmed innocent people. Charles spoke with visible emotion about the environmental journalist Sarah Mitchell, whose career had been damaged for asking legitimate questions, and about the former palace employee who had been intimidated into silence for raising valid concerns about financial management. William listened carefully as his father detailed the reforms he was prepared to implement to address these problems. The surveillance operations would be immediately terminated, with all monitoring equipment removed and private investigation contracts canceled. The legal intimidation campaigns would be halted, with pending cases reviewed to determine which should be withdrawn entirely. The media manipulation strategies would be dismantled, with financial arrangements that compromised journalistic independence brought to an end. More significantly, Charles proposed the creation of an independent oversight body that would monitor royal household operations and investigate complaints about abuse of power or unethical behavior. This body would include representatives from journalism, environmental organizations, civil liberties groups, and other constituencies that had been affected by palace intimidation campaigns. Its reports would be made public, ensuring transparency and accountability in palace operations. The king also outlined plans for providing appropriate acknowledgement and compensation to individuals who had been harmed by palace pressure campaigns. This would include public apologies in cases where intimidation tactics had been applied inappropriately, financial compensation for documented career damage, and assistance in restoring professional relationships that had been damaged by palace interference. William was moved by his father's genuine recognition of the problems and his comprehensive approach to addressing them. However, he also recognized that implementing these reforms would be extremely difficult and would face resistance from palace staff members who had built their careers around the surveillance and reputation management operations that were being dismantled. The conversation turned to the practical challenges of reform implementation. Many of the staff members involved in surveillance operations were long-term employees who had been following direct orders from senior advisors and ultimately from the king himself. Dismantling these operations would require careful management to avoid creating additional victims while ensuring that inappropriate activities were completely eliminated. Charles had already begun addressing some of these challenges by working with human resources professionals to develop transition plans for staff members whose roles would be eliminated by the reforms. Some employees would be reassigned to legitimate security or public relations functions, while others would receive generous severance packages and career transition assistance to help them find appropriate employment outside the royal household. The king had also consulted with legal experts about potential criminal liability related to surveillance operations and intimidation campaigns. While most activities had been conducted within technically legal boundaries, some operations had crossed lines that could result in criminal charges for invasion of privacy or harassment. Charles was committed to cooperating fully with any official investigations and ensuring that victims had access to appropriate legal remedies. Perhaps most importantly, the reforms would include fundamental changes to palace culture and decision-making processes to prevent similar problems from developing in the future. New protocols would require that any security or public relations operations be reviewed by independent legal advisors before implementation. Staff members would receive training on ethical boundaries and would be protected from retaliation if they raised concerns about inappropriate activities. William expressed his appreciation for his father's comprehensive approach, while also emphasizing the importance of public disclosure about the reforms being implemented. The credibility of the monarchy could only be restored through transparency about what had gone wrong and what was being done to fix it. This would require a carefully planned public statement that acknowledged past mistakes while demonstrating genuine commitment to change. The two men spent several hours developing a communication strategy that would inform the public about the reforms without causing unnecessary damage to the institution of monarchy. The statement would need to be honest about the scope of the problems while emphasizing the proactive nature of the reforms being implemented. It would also need to demonstrate that the changes were driven by ethical conviction rather than political pressure or crisis management. Charles proposed that William play a prominent role in announcing and implementing the reforms, recognizing that his son's moral authority and commitment to transparency would be essential for restoring public confidence. William would chair the independent oversight body and would take personal responsibility for ensuring that victims of past intimidation campaigns received appropriate acknowledgement and compensation. This proposal represented more than just a practical solution to the immediate crisis. It marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between Charles and William, with the king explicitly acknowledging his son's superior moral judgment on these issues and delegating significant authority to ensure that reforms were properly implemented. The announcement of the reforms was carefully planned for maximum impact and credibility. Rather than a traditional palace statement that might be dismissed as damage control, Charles decided to give a personal television address that would allow him to speak directly to the British people about what had happened and what was being done to address it. The address, broadcast on a Sunday evening in late January, was unlike any previous royal communication in its directness and acknowledgement of institutional failures. Charles spoke honestly about surveillance operations and intimidation campaigns that had violated democratic principles and harmed innocent individuals. He took personal responsibility for authorizing these activities and expressed genuine remorse for their impact on victims. More importantly, the king outlined the comprehensive reforms being implemented to prevent similar problems in the future. He announced William's role in overseeing these changes and emphasized that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to earn public trust through transparent and ethical behavior rather than through surveillance and manipulation. The public reaction to Charles's address was mixed but generally positive. Many people appreciated the unusual honesty and the comprehensive nature of the reforms being implemented. Environmental groups and journalism organizations cautiously welcomed the changes while emphasizing that their judgment would depend on actual implementation rather than promises. Some critics argued that the reforms did not go far enough and that constitutional changes were needed to prevent future abuses of royal power. Others suggested that the surveillance operations represented such serious violations of democratic principles that they warranted criminal investigation and potential prosecution of those responsible. However, the overall response suggested that Charles's decision to acknowledge problems and implement comprehensive reforms had prevented a much more serious crisis. By taking responsibility and demonstrating genuine commitment to change, he had preserved the possibility of restoring public confidence in the monarchy. William's role in implementing the reforms proved crucial to their credibility and effectiveness. His personal meetings with victims of intimidation campaigns, his oversight of the dismantling of surveillance operations, and his leadership of the independent accountability body demonstrated that the changes were real rather than cosmetic. The journalist Sarah Mitchell was among the first to receive a personal apology from William and appropriate compensation for the damage to her career caused by palace intimidation tactics. She was also invited to join the independent oversight body to help ensure that similar abuses could not happen again. Over the following months, the reforms transformed the culture within the royal household and the monarchy's relationship with the public. Staff members learned to view criticism and scrutiny as healthy aspects of democratic accountability rather than threats to be neutralized. Media relationships were rebuilt on the basis of mutual respect and professional independence rather than financial dependence and intimidation. The long-term impact of these changes extended far beyond the immediate crisis they were designed to address. By demonstrating that the monarchy could acknowledge serious mistakes and implement meaningful reforms. Charles and William had shown that traditional institutions could adapt to democratic expectations without losing their essential character. The surveillance operations and intimidation campaigns that had once seemed necessary for protecting the monarchy were revealed to have been its greatest threat. By abandoning these tactics in favor of transparency and accountability, the royal family had not only preserved its constitutional role, but had strengthened the foundation for its future relevance in British society. The crisis that had begun with William's moral courage in confronting unethical practices had ultimately resulted in a monarchy that was more honest, more accountable, and more worthy of public trust than it had been in decades. The secrets that had been so carefully guarded had indeed unraveled, but their exposure had led not to the destruction of the institution but to its moral renewal and democratic legitimacy.